In this episode, we're going to be doing something a little different. I'm going to be guiding you through how to make an astrologically timed botanical cold process soap. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the Arcanvm Patreon by clicking the link provided below this video, or a one-time donation to help me continue to produce free, well-researched, and practiced content like this. I'm Ike Baker, and this is Arcanvm. A couple of weeks ago, I took advantage of a particularly auspicious Venus election. This type of astrology, known as electional astrology, pertains to the timing of specific events, rituals, or projects. Some good things to use electional astrology for might include when to start a business, when to premiere a video, when to make a financial investment or important decision. These, of course, are only very few examples of situations where electional would be appropriate. Typically, there are a few key things to note. The first one is it important? Important enough to wait for a good election? As these aren't typically easy to come by, depending on the type of working that you're planning to do. Secondly, what is the intention or goal? What are you hoping to accomplish? This will decide what you look for in an election. The next considerations would be the dignity of the moon and the ruler of the ascendant, which is the ruling planet of the sign that is in the ascendant. But we'll get more into the particulars of the theory behind electional astrology in a separate electional astrology video. Of course, any deadlines or hard time frames are going to confine or narrow down your options, your available electional periods. So with this project, I wanted to capitalize on some Venusian energy. So I decided to focus on something that typically can produce a very personal and luxurious self-care experience. So I chose soap. I've been making soap from scratch for about 2 years. It's one of many self-sufficiency skills we practice here in the mountains, and it's one of my favorite to actually do. The end product will be handcrafted Venusian soap bars with rose plant material and supportive essential oils for a relaxing and pleasurable aromatic stimulation. For this, I chose plant essential oils that had supportive planetary correspondences: cedar, which corresponds to Jupiter, and lavender, which corresponds to the moon. These correspondences can differ depending on the part of the plant used and which references you're using. In the past, I've used Culpeper, Skinner, and a few other references, but I find that spending time with certain plants is the best way to understand their main correspondences. That said, let's move on to the soap making process. To make true soap, the basic ingredients you need are water, sodium hydroxide, generically known as lye, and fat. If it doesn't contain these three ingredients, then it's not soap. You'll find lots of synthetic hygiene products labeled as body bars and things like this as a consequence. The chemical process which creates soap occurs naturally, in nature, and is called saponification. In fact, this term, according to legend, comes from the ancient Roman mountain Sapo, whereon sacrifices were routinely made to the gods. The animal fats and pyre carbon would then mix and wash down to a river below. And people found that their bodies and clothes became cleaner when washing in this river. Regardless of the historical veracity of this story, what I like most about the process is that it's alchemical in nature. You take three separate things, mix them together correctly, and they come together to form something completely new, a product called soap. Lye is formed when rainwater passes through pot ash. It's simple enough to do this at home, but to save time, I'll usually buy it. It's important to use distilled water so that there are no heavy metals or other dense or foreign materials in it that could potentially affect the chemical processes that will take place when all the ingredients are finally added together. Lastly, you can use any kind of lipid or fat that is available, although if using animal fats, you'll have to render what is called the tallow. We typically use a combination of fractionated coconut oil and olive oil, one hard oil, one soft oil. This gives a good balance of longevity, consistency, and moisturizing properties to the bar. When the chemical structure of all three have been bound and altered in the saponification process, a molecule which is both polar and nonpolar is formed. Skipping the chemistry lesson, it has one head that is hydrophilic and one head that is hydrophobic. In other words, one end of the molecule binds to water and the other binds to stuff like oils and dirt. Hence, when you rinse off a good lather, the day's grime goes down the drain with it. Let's get started. First and foremost, you'll need safety equipment. Goggles, mask, gloves. I'd also recommend using a long sleeve shirt. You'll need some white vinegar as well as part of your safety precautions. It has a very low pH, and so it can balance out or neutralize the lye and water solution, which causes chemical burns. You'll need a small postal scale for weighing out your materials. I highly recommend that you keep a journal to record all of these recipes and experiments out. A mortar and pestle today for our plant material, which is a dried rose flower from our rose gardens out front. It has been used in ritual before. We've got here some locally made lavender and cedar wood essential oils. Stick blender, some sodium hydroxide, bottled lye, great drain cleaner actually, and we've got our fats. We've also got distilled H2O and a whisk for adding the essential oils. We'll see why later, and a variety of bowls and spoons that particularly stainless steel is good because it doesn't alter under corrosive substances. The first task is to measure out our distilled H2O using the postal scale and a stainless steel bowl. For this recipe I use about 18 fluid ounces. Next up, you'll need to very carefully measure out your lye. I use about 7 ounces of lye. Adds up quickly. Now the next part will need to take place in a very well ventilated area, and this is the only segment of this that is dangerous or can be dangerous at some point. In fact, I do recommend that you do not try this at home. So in a well ventilated area, I set up my water. I've got my lye, and I always add my lye to water, never water to lye. Pour it in nice and slowly. This will heat up very quickly, and temperature is a major factor in these processes. Once all the lye is mixed into the water, I want to continue to mix it thoroughly and slowly so that it becomes a lye solution. We'll let that sit outside for a little while, cool down, let the lye finish dissolving, and we'll come back inside and measure out our olive oil. I use about 24 ounces. Next up, we've got to spoon out relatively the same 24 ounces of coconut oil. I like to do 50-50 split, but this has to be melted down so that it's a liquid. This will also raise the temperature of the oil mixture. Once the two are mixed, I also let that sit to cool. I've got my rose material. There has been some energetic preparation to the plant material before use as plant material in the soap, and I'll just finely grind it up. Really it'll tear before anything else, but it's become fairly brittle because it's aged so long, but it should eventually reach the consistency of fish food. Next up, I'll measure out my essential oils. For this, I want a nice even balance of about 1 ounce apiece, 1 ounce of cedar, 1 ounce of lavender. So there is a specific temperature that most soap makers prefer, and that would be between 120 and 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And many soap makers and references have mentioned that it's most likely helpful to have the lye and oil within 10 degrees of each other. If you remember, both of these have undergone thermal processes. Now, there's several reasons for this, but I feel that I've been doing it with enough success for long enough to be able to go by feel. Once we mix the lye solution and the oils, science is happening. There's no turning back at this point. The mixture will create a sort of hazy, cloudy sort of liquid. You want to add the lye solution slowly, stirring and pumping alternately with the stick blender. This process used to take much longer when it was done in a cauldron in like the town square. They'd have these big soap balls at the end of the day, using massive quantities of fat and lye solution. But now we can speed a day's work up to about 20 minutes with a stick blender. So we want to stir and pump and then eventually just keep that stick blender engaged the whole time. Mine has 2 settings, so I'll start it off on low and then progress to high. What we're looking for is something called trace, and trace is the consistency of our mixture once enough of the saponification process has been affected. To yield a consistency that's kind of like a watery pudding, that would be light trace. It's at the point of reaching light trace that you want to slowly whisk in your essential oils. Now we do this because the essential oils and their addition to our mixture has the potential to affect trace. Typically it'll make it much more watery if done too quickly. And we don't want that to happen. We want a nice, slow, consistent trace, so we stir this in very thoroughly. You'll see that it creates this kind of like candy stripe thing where it's sort of resisting absorption into the mixture. You want to just keep going nice and thoroughly, slowly, until that is completely mixed in. From there, we'll throw the stick blender back in and keep it on low to high until we hit medium trace. Now that's when you knock off a little bit of the mixture here, and it lands on the surface of the mixture in the bowl, kind of like a cake batter or pudding again, but it doesn't stay firm. It kind of just melts or melds back into the overall mixture in the bowl, and you stir them back in. Now, I would advise during this process that you keep a mantra or a sort of meditative image on Venus, or whatever your featured planetary energy might be. You could also burn some, say, incense that has a correspondence. Rose incense would be great for Venus. You could have some music that corresponds or pertains to the nature of the planet in some way playing. Cultivate that mood. Now, once you reach trace, you'll knock off the stick blender, and those little drops will fall on the surface, and they won't melt back in. They'll stay defined at the top, and it will essentially, this will be the consistency of a firm cake batter, and that's how you know that you are ready to batch. These get batch molded into soap molds, which are essentially these wooden rectangles that have an inner rubber slip, so that this way you can just pull the rubber out and then peel it off of that bar. But once it's been molded or batched, you want to put a layer of saran wrap over the top, and then also cover it with with cloth or some kind of cloth towel. Now, you want a nice even cure, which means essentially that you don't want the moisture from the outer surface area layer to just completely dissipate and then have the soap dry out on the outside, take a little bit longer. It's not an even curing process. So covering your batch molds has a way of allowing the moisture to dissipate evenly. Temperature is also supremely important in these processes. So you don't want the outer surface area to drop in temperature faster than the interior. So that needs to cure now for about 24 hours before it can be cut. After 24 hours, you pull it out and you use soap cutting blades. We have a few. Our favorite seems to be the crinkle cutter. And you cut these into even bars. And at that point, they're just malleable enough to be cut. They haven't cured to the point of becoming really hardened. It would be much harder to cut a bar of soap that way. Then from there, they should be kept in a cool, again, well-ventilated, dark area to cure for 4 to 6 weeks. Now, they have to sit on a shelf before you can use them for at least a month, and that's so that the saponification process completely solidifies and there are no vestiges of lye solution and oil. One note about essential oils: you want to be careful about what kind of essential oils you use. Typically, citric acid is a skin irritant, so we avoid putting oils like orange or lemon or anything like that, having a citric acid in it, because it can be harmful to the skin, especially when exposed to sunlight. It can actually burn. And there we have our beautiful Venusian Rose Cedar Lavender Bar, for use whenever a Venusian influence is required. What other kind of practical astrological work would you like to see? Is there a particular self-sufficiency skill that you've developed? What other ways do you apply practical astrology and magic to your daily life? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Join me again in the next video, where we'll dive deeper into the history, theory, and practical sides of this and many other related topics. Thanks for watching. In Luke's